Good afternoon. My name is David Jacobson. I'm the director of the program in Judaic Studies here at Brown. I want to welcome you to the annual David B. and Arthur B. Jacobson Lecture in the study of anti-Semitism. When David and Arthur Jacobson completed their army service in World War II, they took advantage of the GI Bill, which covered educational costs for those who had completed army service, and they did their undergraduate study at Brown. In gratitude to Brown for the education they received, a number of years ago they established an endowment that is administrated by the Program of Judaic Studies to study the field of anti-Semitism. We very much appreciate the co-sponsorship of this lecture by the Watson Institute for International Public Affairs, and including the opportunity of being in this room here at the Joukowsky Forum. I'm delighted to welcome to Brown Professor Ethan Katz. He's professor of history and director of the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of California at Berkeley. Professor Katz is the author of The Burdens of Brotherhood, Jews and Muslims from North Africa to France, published by Harvard University Press. He is also co-editor with Lisa Moses Leff and Maud Mandel of Colonialism and the Jews, published by Indiana University Press. His current research project is provisionally entitled Freeing the Empire, the Uprising of Jews and Antisemites that helped win World War II. For the past several years, Professor Katz has been engaged in public conversations about anti-Semitism on and beyond the University of California, Berkeley campus. He serves as the chair of the Chancellor's Advisory Committee on Jewish Student Life and Campus Climate at Berkeley, and he's the co-founder of what is known as the Antisemitism Education Initiative at Berkeley. This initiative engages people in conversations about how to assess and combat anti-Semitism in universities today. This effort has brought together administrators, faculty, leaders of the campus Jewish community to create a sustained program of education around anti-Semitism. From 2021 to 2023, he chaired a task force of the Association for Jewish Studies on anti-Semitism and academic freedom, which produced a set of guidelines that have been widely embraced by a number of scholars throughout the United States. Many of the lectures funded by the Jacobson Brothers Endowment have presented anti-Semitism as events that happened in the past, in past history. Today's lecture will focus on issues related to anti-Semitism in the present here in the United States and in other countries. Professor Katz will speak on, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitic? New perspectives on a controversial issue. Please join me in welcoming Professor Katz.
Good afternoon. Can everybody hear me okay? Great. I want to invite people in the back to try to find seats on the stairs if you like. I don't bite, and as long as the fire marshal doesn't come in here, we can probably accommodate more people. Thanks so much to David for that very warm and kind introduction. It's really always a pleasure to be here at Brown, and I'm delighted to be able to share my thoughts on this topic in a space with so many highly engaged colleagues and students. Now, I originally agreed to give this talk months ago, months before the events of October 7th and the war in Gaza and Israel that's followed, but of course, current events have altered significantly the context in which we're having this conversation about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Despite that current context, and despite David's comment about the contemporary nature of my topic, I am a historian. And so a lot of my talk is meant to give us what Michel Foucault used to call a critical history of the present with regard to this debate over anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, while also turning our attention to the present moment toward the end of my remarks. I just want to explain that I have a timer here on my phone, so if I'm looking at it, it's just so that I don't talk forever. It's not because I'm checking messages from faraway people. Okay, let's start with terminology, because it's here that our problems begin in our current conversations about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. We suffer from a remarkable lack of attention to terminology and to context. And my talk is really going to try to serve as something of a corrective by exploring four facets of the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. First, I'm going to talk about terminology and trying to bring conceptual clarity to the discussion. Second, I will talk about the long history of what I call critical anti-Zionism, which has often been self-consciously and explicitly distinct from anti-Semitism. Third, I will discuss what I term negationist anti-Zionism, which is often fueled by hatred and which frequently overlaps substantially with anti-Semitism. And finally, I will discuss the significant impact of October 7th and the events and discussions that have followed for the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. So terminology and conceptual clarity. Defining anti-Semitism has become a notoriously thorny topic in contemporary discussions, as some of you may have heard. There are three major competing definitions of anti-Semitism that have generated tremendous debate and controversy, most often connected to the matter of where critique of Israel, sometimes termed anti-Zionism, does or does not intersect with anti-Semitism. And I'm not going to rehearse these definitions or debates here, though I'm happy to discuss them in the Q&A. But drawing on these definitions, I want to posit a relatively straightforward definition of anti-Semitism that I think should suffice for our purposes. And I think it can help to guide our discussion about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism, for our purposes, is discrimination, hatred, or exclusion against Jewish individuals, groups, entities, or institutions because they are Jewish. Anti-Semitism includes attitudes, actions, and systemic conditions that impede or condition Jews' capacity to participate as equals in political, religious, cultural, economic, or social life. While it shares important features with other hatreds like anti-black racism, Islamophobia, or anti-LGBTQ+ discrimination, unlike most exclusionary systems or ideologies, anti-Semitism does not vilify its victims as inferior, but rather as having too much privilege and power. Across a large chronological and geographical sweep, several anti-Semitic stereotypes and conspiracy theories have persisted. In particular, Jews have been seen as wealthy or greedy, powerful, controlling puppeteers, cunning and untrustworthy, disloyal to their country or locality in favor of an ultimate loyalty to the Jewish people or Jewish state, and bloodthirsty, violent, and evil. If it's hard to define anti-Semitism, at least it's been the subject of robust inquiry and debate for well over a decade. Anti-Zionism is actually far less well defined. I really discovered that in preparing this lecture. And so here's where terminological precision is a major part of our trouble in our current conversations. And I would even hazard a guess that if I took a poll of 10 different people in this room or on the Zoom where some people are watching, I would probably get 8 to 10 different definitions of anti-Zionism. And part of this reflects the complexity of Zionism as a historical and contemporary phenomenon, which is also often misunderstood. So I'm going to talk for a moment about how we define Zionism. At its most basic level, Zionism is an ideology, movement, and set of on-the-ground practices and policies in support of an entity that allows for Jewish self-determination, collective rights, and security in some portion of Jews' historic homeland. Some refer to this land as historic Palestine, others call it the land of Israel. I hope I will not offend anyone here if I refer to it sometimes as one or the other, or sometimes as Israel-Palestine. Today it is the combined territory of the State of Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. While widely understood as a movement for Jewish national and cultural liberation and renewal, from its beginnings in the late 19th century, Zionism has always taken multiple forms. These have included political aspirations to establish a state entity that could, quote, normalize Jews' collective existence and guarantee their political rights in the face of rising anti-Semitism. Socialist or labor Zionism that saw the movement as part of a larger effort to forge a new social contract empowering workers and respect for land and manual labor. Cultural Zionism focused on the land of Israel as a center for spiritual and cultural renewal for Jews worldwide. Religious Zionism that sees Jewish migration as part of a long-prophesied ingathering of the exiles that will hasten the coming of the Messiah and the ultimate redemption. And diaspora Zionism, which has been less about Jews relocating to Israel en masse and much more about building a movement of solidarity in support of Zionist settlement and growth among Jewish communities outside of Israel. All of these Zionisms had to answer over time the question of what to do about the native Arab population living in Israel-Palestine, and for more than a century their answers have ranged from maximalist visions that propose Jewish sovereignty and hierarchical control over every inch of the territory, to a partition into two states, one Jewish, the other Arab, divided along a range of possible borderlines, to some kind of binational or federated single-state solution that maintains both Jewish and Arab character and self-determination within the same state. Whatever their specific program, most Zionists perceived the establishment of the Israeli state through a vote of the United Nations and then a war for independence in 1947 to 1949 as the fulfillment of the movement's central goals. Of course, simultaneous to its development as a national liberation movement for Jews, Zionism has meant something profoundly different for Palestinian Arabs. For most Palestinians, Zionism has meant an unceasing story of conquest, displacement, and violence over many decades. This experience is emblematized by what Palestinians call the Nakba of 1948, the displacement of some 700,000 or more Palestinians that accompanied Israel's founding as a Jewish state. Indeed, the 1948 war that effectively resolved the so-called Jewish question created a new Palestinian question that remains unresolved to this day. And yet, for most Palestinians, the Nakba is not simply 1948. Rather, it is everything that has happened since that time. From Israel's methodical destruction of more than 400 Palestinian villages and towns in the years following the birth of the state, to the regularized settler violence that continues up to the present, to the death and destruction wrought by the current Israeli military campaign in Gaza. Now, given Zionism's disparate meanings, we can begin already to get at the difficulty in defining anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism resonates in entirely incompatible ways among those who consider themselves Zionists or have a strong sense of attachment of some form to Israel on the one hand, and those who consider themselves anti-Zionist or strongly opposed in some way to Israel. For most Zionists and self-declared supporters of the State of Israel, being anti-Zionist is heard as being against the Jewish state in every way, questioning its right to exist and possibly threatening the lives of its Jewish inhabitants. By contrast, for many, if not most, anti-Zionists, being anti-Zionist means opposing the oppression of Palestinians, without necessarily offering any clear political program aside from vague references to liberation. And yet, for many of these anti-Zionists, Zionism has come to stand in for a host of other forces they oppose, such as imperialism, racism, oppression, and most recently, even ill-defined notions of genocide. When the battle is waged in this way, between vague notions of the right of the Jewish people to have self-determination in their historic biblical homeland on one side, and evil oppressive forces of imperialism, domination, and oppression on the other, we find ourselves with a debate that is less and less about the lives of actual Israelis and Palestinians and more instrumentalized. This impedes clarity rather than providing it. In thinking about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, I think it is particularly important to keep in mind three sets of distinctions. The first is between Zionism as an idea and Zionism as a lived reality. Typically, anti-Zionists focus on one or the other. In the first instance, they oppose or do not accept the core ideological tenet of Zionism, that Jews have the right to a sovereign national home in some part of their ancestral homeland. In the second instance, they oppose the current policies, institutions, and often the entity itself that instantiates that core tenet, the State of Israel. In the latter case, anti-Zionists define Zionism in the pithy formulation of one of its most prominent Jewish critics as what Israel does. Admittedly, even here, clarity eludes us, since for some opposing, quote, what Israel does means simply opposing its policies. But for others, it means opposing everything it does, including its very existence. This leads us to the second distinction between what I will call here critical anti-Zionism versus negationist anti-Zionism. The former is fundamentally about critiquing what is wrong, historically or at present, with the way Zionism as an ideology or set of practices has developed and unfolded. Critical anti-Zionism endeavors to focus its attacks on a state, Israel, or a political project, Zionist nation building, and to insist that these are not attacks on Jews broadly. Critical anti-Zionism can often take the form of specific critiques and or proposals for fundamentally reshaping the political order in Israel-Palestine. Some of these proposals, even if radical, actually echo other minority forms of Zionism. By contrast, negationist anti-Zionism rejects the legitimacy of the Zionist project altogether, or calls explicitly or by implication for the elimination of the State of Israel, or any state that maintains collective Jewish self-determination in some form in a part of Israel-Palestine. This form of anti-Zionism is often what some scholars call erasive, as it ignores, downplays, or writes out, i.e. erases from history, the long-standing Jewish roots in the land of Israel, the long history and ongoing reality of anti-Semitism, the history of Zionism in the State of Israel, and Jewish-Israeli perspectives on the conflict. In critiquing Israel, negationist anti-Zionism frequently employs anti-Jewish tropes. As illuminated in Derek Penslar's important new book on the emotional history of Zionism, these two types of anti-Zionism also occupy rather different emotional registers. Critical anti-Zionism, like many forms of critique, may include fierce anger, but can also be informed by emotions of love and hope toward Israel or Jews. Negationist anti-Zionism is shaped in significant part by hatred of Israel, and all too often of Jews as a collective more broadly. Indeed, while, as we shall see throughout history and up to the present, critical anti-Zionism has very often not been anti-Semitic, negationist anti-Zionism very often incorporates anti-Semitism into its worldview. The last distinction I want to draw our attention to at the outset is that between intention and impact. In many instances, there is a gap between the intentional goals of those most critical of Israel and the effect of their words or actions. If we want to measure whether a given expression of anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic, it is crucial to distinguish between anti-Semitic intentions versus anti-Semitic effects. We will return in particular to these distinctions when we discuss the developments since October 7th. So, critical anti-Zionism. If I have, perhaps for some people, belabored points of terminology, it's because they are not small matters, and the lack of clarity and precision in these areas too often trips us up. Any intelligent discussion of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism has to grapple with the complexity of anti-Semitism in its many forms, Zionism in its multivariate history and present, and the competing meanings assigned to the notion of, quote, anti-Zionism by those who identify as anti-Zionists and those who are their fiercest critics. So with this having been laid, let's move to a brief history of what I've called critical anti-Zionism. The primary sites for this type of anti-Zionism have been competing movements in modern Jewish politics and in Palestinian Arab opposition to Zionism. In a sense, there were Jewish anti-Zionists before there were modern Zionists. Jewish reformers and liberal advocates for individual rights for Jews had advocated for decades for what they called emancipation, or equal citizenship for Jews in Western societies, with the clear understanding that one of the prices of equality was the renunciation of any claim to a separate Jewish nationalism or to the revival of a separate Jewish state. In 1885, in the famous Pittsburgh Platform drafted by Reform rabbis in the United States, Reform rabbis declared emphatically, quote, "We consider ourselves no longer a nation but a religious community, and therefore expect neither a return to Palestine nor a sacrificial worship under the sons of Aaron, nor the restoration of any of the laws concerning the Jewish state." From a different vantage point, most traditional Jewish religious authorities had long taken a dim view of any movement to promote large-scale Jewish migration to Palestine or the establishment of a Jewish polity there, believing that Jewish law prohibited such activity until the time of the coming of the Messiah. Indeed, two of the towering figures of early Zionism, the liberal Theodor Herzl and the religious Rabbi Avraham Yitzhak Kook, they derive much of their potency and influence from the way that they departed from the deep antipathies of Jewish liberalism and Torah Judaism, respectively, vis-a-vis the prospect of a modern Jewish nationalism focused on a return to the land of Israel. In the decades after the Zionist movement's founding, countries where Jews had attained legal equality rapidly and achieved robust levels of integration were often places where many Jewish leaders spoke openly against Zionism. In 1904, Lucien Wolfe, for instance, a British Jewish journalist, diplomat, and activist on behalf of Jewish rights, published an essay called The Zionist Peril, where he called himself, quote, a convinced and uncompromising anti-Zionist. There, in addition to lodging numerous critiques against Zionism for its faults, he insisted, quote, the real Jewish nationalism, the only true Zion, was the prophetic goal of, quote, lofty toleration and universalism. Zionism for Wolfe was a dead-end ideal that would only provoke increased anti-Semitism. Anti-Zionism both returned Jews to an older tradition of Jewish universalism and helped Jews in their ongoing effort to be identified as fully European citizens of their home countries. While on the whole, attitudes among establishment Jews toward Zionism began to soften in the years following the 1917 Balfour Declaration, in the United States and France, today home to the world's two largest diaspora Jewish communities, a major shift toward acceptance of Zionism among the mainstream of the community did not begin until the middle of the 1940s during World War II. Indeed, until 1948, far more Jews worldwide were avid anti-Zionists than were actively Zionist. For decades, Reform Judaism took a hard line against Zionism, finding the movement's particularism and nationalistic and territorial foci antithetical to core Reform commitments like defining Judaism as a religion, seeing it as the basis for universalistic ethics and social justice movements, and embracing full Jewish acculturation in diaspora societies. The 1937 Columbus Platform marked a shift by seeing in, quote, the rehabilitation of Palestine the promise of renewed life for many of our brethren, and it asserted, quote, the obligation of all Jewry to aid in its upbuilding as a Jewish homeland, haven of refuge for the oppressed, and center of Jewish culture and spiritual life. In 1942, the Reform movement's flagship organization, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the CCAR, voted to support the formation of a Jewish army in Palestine. And yet, even so, it was only in 1977 that the Reform movement sought to become an officially Zionist-affiliated organization. Other manifestations of Jewish anti-Zionism also emerged, in each case based upon a distinctive vision of Jewish politics quite at odds with the assumptions of Zionism. Well into the post-World War II era, many leading European and American Jews, such as George Steiner and Hannah Arendt, embraced a secular version of the same points of emphasis as Reform Judaism, that is, on Jews as a cosmopolitan, universalist, global group defined by ethical values, and they all maintained a wary posture toward the young Jewish state. From the late 19th to the mid-20th century, a variety of Jewish socialist organizations, particularly those connected to Yiddishism, took an entirely different diasporic approach to both Jewish nationalism and Jewish socialism. And therefore, they opposed Zionism in a spirited contest for the hearts and minds of the Jewish masses in many countries and locales. The most notable anti-Zionist organization in America in the mid-20th century was a group called the American Council for Judaism, or the ACJ. Founded in 1943 as a breakaway from the CCAR, the ACJ was created to, quote, defend and promote classical reforms anti-Zionism. Its leading figure, Rabbi Elmer Berger, wrote in his 1945 book, The Jewish Dilemma, that he, quote, could not write about a Jewish people because there is none. And he claimed that, quote, to designate Jews as a national group is a vestige of the past. Eventually, Berger laid out a tripartite argument in defense of his anti-Zionism. First of all, Judaism had to be sharply distinguished from Zionism, since Judaism is a religion and not a nationalism. Full stop. Secondly, anti-Zionists are, in his words, quote, neither anti-Jewish nor anti-Semitic, a statement that may sound preemptive, but was also a response to the increasingly dim view of vehement anti-Zionism in the era following the Shoah and the establishment of Israel as a Jewish state. And third, Zionism not only provoked anti-Semitism, he argued, but was actually anti-Semitism itself, since according to Berger and his colleagues, it entailed a form of state-sponsored discrimination based upon race and religion against American Jews. Now, the ACJ never became more than a fringe organization, but my colleague James Leffler has argued persuasively in an important and pioneering study on the major strands of anti-Zionism that Berger's ideas had important legacies. In particular, when left-wing American Jewish intellectuals of the late 20th century, such as Daniel Boyarin and Judith Butler, argued that anti-Zionism was a return to a deeply rooted, authentic, and necessary diaspora Jewish politics, or that it was the sine qua non for a contemporary radical Jewish politics, they could be heard to echo the earlier ideas of the ACJ. At the organizational level, Jewish Voice for Peace, JVP, has sought to claim a similar mantle for its own ardent and unabashed anti-Zionism. Now, to return for a moment to the issue of emotional registers that I noted earlier, citing Derek Penslar's new book, part of what is noticeable about many, if not most, of the foregoing examples is the way that they are animated by expressions of love and commitment, rather than anything like hatred toward Jews, Judaism, and Jewish culture. In more recent times, a number of movements highly critical of the situation in Israel have also spoken explicitly from a vantage point of love and commitment, and yet have been branded anti-Zionist by many of their opponents. The most recent example, probably among the more visible, would be J Street, founded in 2007 as a more left-wing, peace-oriented alternative to the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC. J Street has claimed that only by fighting for a two-state solution could Israel maintain its core democratic character and values. Despite such professions and the considerable number of rabbis, Jewish community professionals, and highly committed lay leaders involved with J Street, the organization has repeatedly been branded by critics as dangerously anti-Zionist and has been kept at a distance in rather deliberate ways by the mainstream American Jewish community. So on the whole, we can see that over a very long historical arc, a number of Jewish organizations and Jewish community leaders have been vocally critical of the Zionist project, while avowing commitments to Jewish religion, culture, and people that make it difficult to reasonably call them anti-Semitic or, as some people might prefer, self-hating. Perhaps surprisingly, though, the same is true for a number of the most visible Palestinian Arab critics of Zionism from the movement's very inception until the present. Perhaps the earliest known expression of this kind of critical anti-Zionism comes in a famous letter from the accomplished Palestinian scholar and former mayor of Jerusalem, Yusuf Dia al-Din Pasha al-Khalidi, written to Theodore Herzl in 1899. Al-Khalidi wrote with respect for Herzl, quote, as a man, as a writer of talent, and as a true Jewish patriot, and with great respect for Judaism and Jews, whose commonalities and connections with Muslims he emphasized. He condemned the persecution of Jews in Europe, and he expressed his understanding for the driving motivations behind Herzl's nascent movement. He declared that Zionism was, quote, natural, beautiful, and just, and exclaimed, quote, who could contest the right of the Jews to Palestine? My God, historically, it is your country. And yet, in the present realities, whatever the arguments for Zionism, he said, quote, the brutal force of circumstances had to be taken into account. In particular, that, quote, Palestine is an integral part of the Ottoman Empire, and more gravely, it is inhabited by others who would never assent, he said, to being overtaken by newcomers. Moreover, bringing Zionism to Palestine would divide the Jews, Muslims, and Christians who currently lived there and would end up harming, he said, the position of Jews. On the whole, if one operated, quote, with full knowledge of the facts, close quote, one had to see that it was, quote, pure folly for Zionists to plan to take over the territory. Therefore, while, quote, nothing could be more just and equitable than for the unhappy Jewish nation to find refuge, it should do so elsewhere. In the name of God, he pleaded, let Palestine be left alone. A decade later, at a meeting in Jerusalem at the office of Eliezer ben Yehuda, the leading figure in the modern revival of the Hebrew language, a conversation of a similar tenor unfolded with Saad al-Husseini and Mohammed Rui al-Khalidi, both recently elected representatives from the Jerusalem region to the Ottoman parliament. Both al-Husseini and al-Khalidi not only spoke warmly of Jews, but also extended a welcome to Jews who might come to Palestine. What worried them both, however, was the prospect of, quote, large-scale Jewish immigration. Al-Husseini thought that though many more Jews could be accommodated, eventually the country's capacity would be reached and there would not be space for more Jewish immigrants. Al-Khalidi had moral objections based upon history to Jews returning to Palestine to claim it as their birthright from Arabs. Crucially, this conversation and the correspondence that I just mentioned between al-Khalidi and Herzl both occurred within the framework of the Ottoman Empire, a time when it was not at all clear that the empire was going to expire at the end of the First World War, or that the rise of individual nation-states in the Middle East was in the offing. In fact, Dmitry Shumsky has written quite persuasively recently that a number of the early Zionists did not actually envision a nation-state in the contemporary sense. They envisioned a foyer, an area, an autonomous space for Jews in some part of Palestine under imperial control. So objecting to the Zionist project in this historical context hardly meant uniquely rejecting the right of Jews to self-determination or rejecting a Jewish nation-state. Equally importantly, the exchanges mentioned here were characterized by lively back-and-forth discussion, by a sense of critical inquiry and mutual engagement between early Zionist leaders and leaders of the Palestinian Arab community. Now, lest we think that such engagement is some relic of the pre-state period, we can see major Palestinian thinkers of the late 20th and early 21st century who have been among Zionism's fiercest critics and who offered very explicit recognition of Jewish individual and national rights in Israel-Palestine. I'm just going to cite two quick examples. The first may surprise many of you, and it's Edward Said, a figure who I would argue has become much abused by some of the most vociferous advocates for Palestinian liberation at this particular historical juncture. Said was arguably the most influential Palestinian intellectual ever in the Western Academy, among the most influential intellectuals writ large of his generation. His book, The Question of Palestine, first published in 1979, has remained an ur-text for anti-Zionist and pro-Palestinian thought ever since, in particular the essay that forms a chapter in the book entitled Zionism from the Standpoint of Its Victims. Said's basic starting point was that Zionism had only been written about from the standpoint of Jewish history, and not from that of, quote, the Palestinians, for whom Zionism has appeared to be an uncompromisingly exclusionary, discriminatory, colonialist praxis, close quote. Said pulled no punches, framing his critique of Zionism as part and parcel of his larger critique of Western Orientalism and Western colonialism, and insisting, quote, to write critically about Zionism in Palestine has never meant, and does not mean now, being anti-Semitic. For Said, these were not empty words. He felt it urgent to write that no matter the importance of Zionism from the standpoint of its Palestinian victims, quote, it would be totally unjust to neglect the power of Zionism as an idea for Jews, or to minimize the complex internal debates characterizing Zionism, its true meaning, its messianic destiny, etc. Further on, he added, quote, I know as well as any educated Western non-Jew can know what anti-Semitism has meant for the Jews, especially in this century. Consequently, I can understand the intertwined terror and the exultation out of which Zionism has been nourished, and I think I can at least grasp the meaning of Israel for Jews. He even went so far as to say, quote, Zionism has had a large number of successes. There is no doubt in my mind, for example, that most Jews do regard Zionism and Israel as urgently important facts for Jewish life, particularly because of what happened to the Jews in this century. Then, too, Israel has some remarkable political and cultural achievements to its credit. When Said added a new preface for his 1992 edition of The Question of Palestine, writing in the shadow of the recent unprecedented Madrid conference that had brought together Israeli and Palestinian negotiators and that set the stage for the Oslo Accords, Said had become an avowed supporter of the two-state solution. He spent much of that preface praising the decision of the Palestinian leadership to come to the decision in 1988 to demand a state for Palestinians only in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and to endorse United Nations Resolutions 242 and 338 that had come at the conclusions of the 1967 and 1973 wars, respectively, and that had laid the parameters for future negotiations between the Israeli and prospective Palestinian state. Even in the late 1990s, when Said grew frustrated with the Oslo process and wrote a notable piece in the New York Times calling for a one-state solution, he spoke of, quote, self-determination for both peoples, and floated the idea that in a single state, quote, each group would have the same right to practice communal life in its own Jewish or Palestinian way, perhaps in federated cantons, with a joint capital in Jerusalem, equal access to land, and inalienable secular and juridical rights. So while Said may be inscribed in history, and quoted very often today, as a leading light of anti-Zionism, his ideas sounded remarkably reminiscent, as he himself recognized in that essay, of the binational strand of Zionism that had itself enjoyed a brief heyday of consideration in interwar Palestine some 70 years prior. We can see vividly, moreover, that Said was not the forerunner of negationist anti-Zionism that some of his most fervent acolytes and critics might have us believe today. Likewise, even more recently, Rashid Khalidi, maybe the most distinguished living scholar of the history of Palestinian nationalism, has written a new history that is a scathing indictment of the history of Zionism, but that recognizes the reality of Zionism as a national movement for Jews. In this book, whose title tellingly is The 100 Years' War on Palestine, A History of Settler Colonialism and Resistance, 1917 to 2017, Khalidi turns in his conclusion to solutions for the future. There he writes that, quote, Palestinians need weaning from a pernicious delusion rooted in the colonial nature of their encounter with Zionism and in its denial of Palestinian peoplehood, that Jewish Israelis are not a real people, and that they do not have national rights. While it is true that Zionism has transmuted the Jewish religion and the historic peoplehood of Jews into something quite different, a modern nationalism, this does not erase the fact that Israeli Jews today consider themselves a people, with a sense of national belonging in Palestine, what they think of as the land of Israel, no matter how this transmutation came about. He adds, quote, while the fundamentally colonial nature of the Palestinian-Israeli encounter must be acknowledged, there are now two peoples in Palestine, irrespective of how they came into being, and the conflict between them cannot be resolved as long as the national existence of each is denied by the other. Their mutual acceptance can only be based upon complete equality of rights, including national rights. Like Said, Khalidi has severe, overarching critiques of the Zionist project in Israel, but he ends up recognizing many of the core tenets of Zionism, that Israel is a nation-state for Jews whose rights must be recognized, and that in any final status agreement, not only Palestinian Arabs, but Jewish Israelis need to have their national rights recognized. No matter how anti-Zionist his thought and his scholarship, Khalidi clearly cannot countenance denials of the right of Jews to self-determination in some portion of Palestine, or calls for the destruction of the world's only Jewish state. More broadly, this brief survey of Palestinian critical anti-Zionism puts the lie to assumptions, far too widespread in both pro-Palestinian and pro-Israel camps today, that sharp opposition to the way Zionism plays out on the ground, or a defense of Palestinian liberation, must mean a rejection of Israel's legitimacy. There have too often been many Jews and Arabs who have found their voices silenced as anti-Zionist and inter alia anti-Semitic when their speech is harsh and derogatory toward Zionism or Israel, but still lies firmly in the camp of critical Zionism. The vantage point from which these Jews and Arabs write is vital to understanding the logic of their discourses and testing when and where they may venture into more dangerous territory. So here again, we're pointed toward another distinction that I mentioned between intentionality and impact. Let's move now to the second strand that I mentioned, negationist anti-Zionism. So despite everything I've just said, anti-Zionism has historically and at present often ventured too far and meant something very different, and indeed what I call here negationist. That is a total rejection of the right of Jews to self-determination and an attack on the Jewish character of Zionism. This was present not only from Zionism's earliest days, but also among some of the most pioneering and influential anti-Semites in history. none other than Wilhelm Marr, who popularized the term anti-Semitism in 1879, wrote at the time of the First Zionist Congress that, quote, "The entire matter is a foul Jewish swindle in order to divert the attention of the European peoples from the Jewish problem." Nazi ideologue Alfred Rosenberg blamed World War I on the desire of Jews to obtain a state in Palestine, while also claiming that they were so incapable of statecraft that the future Jewish state there would in fact, quote, "be a power base for Jews' global nefarious economic operation." William J. Cameron, the editor of Henry Ford's anti-Semitic newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, from 1921 to 1927, also blamed the First World War on Jews, claiming that they instigated the war in order to turn the British into Jewish puppets in the Middle East and to grab Palestine from the ruins of the Ottoman Empire. Zionism, he charged, was a useful vehicle for both Jewish capital and Jewish Bolshevism. He warned Christians not to be fooled into supporting Jews' fictional claims about the restoration of their ancient biblical homeland. What these few examples, and I could give a lot more of them, indicate is that from the earliest years of Zionism, many anti-Semites associated the movement with their long-standing stereotypes about Jewish power, greed, financial control, clannishness, disloyalty, or conspiracy. That is, simply put, Jews have been conditioned for more than a century to perceive anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism as part and parcel of the same body of perceptions and even political programs vis-a-vis Jews. To put it in musical terms, we can already see why, in many Jewish ears, the notes of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism do not register as contrapuntal melodies played in clashing keys, but rather as something akin to parallel octaves. This is even more the case when we realize that many discourses in both Soviet and Palestinian Arab anti-Zionism, particularly from the 1960s onward, were not only unmistakably tinged with anti-Semitism, but they were very often inseparable from anti-Semitism. In the case of the Soviets, already in the late 1940s, even as Stalin both recognized Israel and helped to arm it for war, a Soviet policy of so-called anti-cosmopolitanism was underway. And this policy attacked Westernism and Jewishness and equated the two both with one another and with Zionism. And it saw them all as parts of a secret anti-communist plot by the US and other Western countries. This outlook helped to account for the show trials and other episodes of state terror against Jews during the last years before Stalin's death in 1953. But as Jim Leffler has traced, it was the context of the Cold War and the rise of Third Worldism in the 1960s that really enabled the Soviet Union to fashion and disseminate a more distinctive, full-on ideology of anti-Semitism that has had a tremendous legacy. So as Israel became more tied to the US and to West Germany, the USSR utilized the United Nations and international debates over racism, human rights, and international law as a venue in which to denounce Zionism as racism. Soviet spokesmen compared Zionism to Nazism, even as they denounced anti-Semitism. In 1964, for example, the Soviet representative at the UN gave a speech where he called upon the international community to take action that would lead to, quote, "the speedy eradication of anti-Semitism, Zionism, Nazism, neo-Nazism, and all other forms of the policy and ideology of colonialism, national and race hatred and exclusiveness." That's a mouthful. There's a lot there. After 1967, these sets of associations grew more intense as the USSR regularly produced writings that claimed Zionism was the equivalent of, quote, genocide in Palestine, while still emphasizing that it was against the, quote, virus of anti-Semitism. After the 1975 UN General Assembly Resolution 3379 that infamously labeled Zionism as racism, Soviet propaganda would claim that Zionism's core principle was indeed racism. By 1981, one publication even insisted that Zionism was all about privileging Jews over non-Jews, making it, quote, a form of racism and racial discrimination that, quote, exploits anti-Semitism to justify its own existence. Soviet propaganda had turned Zionism's original meaning as a movement that was really intended to liberate Jews from anti-Semitism on its head into a movement that allegedly mimicked and benefited from anti-Semitism. Moreover, in the hands of Soviet propagandists, Zionism and anti-Zionism moved from precise descriptions of specific movements into terms that held much broader signifying power for the radical left. Zionism was linked to globalization, to American hegemony, and anti-Zionism represented their opponents. It's striking how strongly this process of inverting anti-Zionism's significance, broadening its international reach, and unmooring it from real events or people in the Middle East echoes with discourses that we hear today. And I think there's probably great dissertation to be written on kind of a Marxist genealogy for many of the anti-Zionist discourses most prevalent on the far left right now. During the same era, meanwhile, a gradual radicalization of anti-Zionism also emerged in the writings and propaganda of Palestinian nationalists. While the 1968 charter of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, rejected all, quote, discrimination of race, color, language, or religion, it spoke of Zionism in terms that denied the movement's origins and validity and demonized its basic character. Now, Zionism was described as, quote, racist and fanatic in its nature, aggressive, expansionist, and colonial in its aims, and fascist in its methods. Moreover, Judaism was described unequivocally as, quote, a religion and not an independent nationality. The only Jews welcome to remain in the territory of Israel-Palestine, according to the charter, were those who had resided there before 1917, since they were, quote, considered Palestinians. This was, by implication, a call for the elimination of all but a handful of Jews from the land between the rivers and the sea. In 1988, the founding charter of Hamas would go a good deal further, calling for, quote, a struggle against the Jews and dubbing Israel, Jews, and Judaism as evil enemies of Islam and Muslim people. Even as the revised charter of 2017 pulled back from this language and denounced anti-Semitism, it described effectively a now so-called Zionist conspiracy for world domination and described Israel's establishment as, quote, entirely illegal and against the will of not only Palestinians, but the entire Muslim Ummah. References like the last one were part of a larger effort to cast anti-Zionism as fundamental to the struggle of radical Islam against the West, a schema that reaches well beyond Israel-Palestine, and in which conspiracy theories about Jews in Israel often play a central role. So we can see here, this, again, brief survey, that since the 1960s, many expressions of both Soviet and Palestinian Arab forms of anti-Zionism became increasingly shrill and divorced from the specifics of Israel-Palestine. In the process, they took on a negationist logic that dismissed entirely the basic tenets of Zionism and claims to Jewish self-determination in some portion of historic Palestine. And they frequently embraced anti-Semitic stereotypes in order to mark their criticisms of Zionism, Israel, or Jews directly. While not all expressions of anti-Zionism that fall into this negationist discourse were immutably anti-Semitic, many, if not most, were. So, to this point, I've tried to help us define our terms with greater precision and to point in broad brushstrokes to two traditions or strands of anti-Zionism that have developed for over a century, what I've called critical anti-Zionism and negationist anti-Zionism, respectively. And I tried to show that each of these strands took particular forms in particular historical contexts. Now I want to talk about the newest historical context, and that would be the period that we've entered since the horrific Hamas-led massacres of October 7th, 2023. How has that affected our understanding of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, and how can this foregoing discussion help us better understand the relationship in this new context? So I want to suggest broadly that there have been three significant changes in this post-October 7th moment. Number one, negationist anti-Zionism has taken center stage to an unprecedented degree. Number two, one of the distinctions I mentioned at the outset between intent and impact has become less visible and, at least for the moment, less relevant. And three, negationist anti-Zionism has taken on far greater bite than it had ever had before. Let me explain each of these shifts in turn. October 7th marked, empirically speaking, by far the largest massacre of Jews since the Shoah. The latest estimates I've seen are over 1,200 victims, plus, of course, more than 230 people who were kidnapped. I don't have to detail the horrific images or descriptions that many of you know of the murder, kidnapping of women and children, babies and the elderly, of entire families. For Jews, this resonated immediately, for many people, as a pogrom, a premeditated, large-scale act of violence against Jews carried out in brutal fashion and meant to incite terror in local and nearby Jewish communities. It reminded Jews of terrible historical episodes of anti-Jewish violence, from massacres during the Crusades to the horrors of the Holocaust. Given that many non-Jews were also murdered and kidnapped, there's debate to be had about whether or not people want to characterize this as an act of anti-Semitism per se. I would argue that in terms of intention, this might be debatable, but that in terms of impact, for reasons I've just cited, it certainly was an anti-Semitic act in terms of who the vast majority of its victims were, how it was experienced by its Jewish victims, and how it was experienced by the Jewish community. And I think even at the level of intent, given the history of Hamas and all of its statements calling for the murder of Jews, demonizing Zionism and Israel, you could make a strong argument for anti-Semitism there as well. But regardless, inside and outside of Israel, most Jews imagined on October 7th and October 8th that whatever was to come in terms of the Israeli reprisals, a potential war, and eventually many questions or critiques about the appropriate response from Israel, that there would be, at least for a moment, almost universal condemnation of the attacks of October 7th as a barbaric act. This expectation was not to be fulfilled. And it was particularly vivid for many of us on college campuses. Numerous pro-Palestinian organizations, before Israel had responded in any retaliatory way, took the massacre of October 7th as the occasion to issue statements glorifying Palestinian resistance to Israel, with no mention of what had taken place, or even a smidgen of concern for lives lost. Others went much further, and they described the massacre as, quote, resistance, to be celebrated in a, quote, freedom struggle. Soon many were shocked to realize that as the news trickled out of what was happening, and Hamas terrorists were literally still going from house to house, seeking to murder as many Israelis and Jews as they could, often in the most vicious and brutal ways imaginable, sometimes bragging before cameras about their exploits. During the same time, some pro-Palestinian organizations, even some pro-Palestinian academic colleagues, were going on social media or gathering petition signatures in order to issue or amplify statements that celebrated these Hamas terrorists as freedom fighters and rejected any critique of their actions. This meant that an act done in the name of anti-Zionism had had horrifically anti-Semitic results and significance for most Jews, and now that anti-Semitism was being dismissed as merely anti-Zionism by many of the most vocal supporters of the Palestinian cause. It's important to say many, right? And many of the loudest, certainly not close to all Palestinians. I don't want to be unclear about that. But when confronted with shock or horror in response, these same thought leaders and organizations doubled down, refusing to condemn Hamas and claiming that they were being called anti-Semitic simply for being pro-Palestinian. In reality, if they were called anti-Semitic, it was for either defending the deliberate and cold-blooded murder of over 1,000 Jewish civilians as simply an act of resistance, or for ignoring the act altogether, for what some scholars deem erasive anti-Semitism, wherein Jewish lives, histories, or perspectives are simply scrubbed from the record. At minimum, Israelis and Jews had been profoundly dehumanized by the unwillingness to condemn the murders, and that in itself, I would argue, was ultimately anti-Semitic. Before long, as Israel entered Gaza with its military campaign, anyone who identified as a Zionist or defended Israel's actions was being described with terms like enablers or even enthusiasts of genocide. All those who supported such military action were being told regularly that they did not care about Palestinian loss of life or consider Palestinians even human at all, while the same organizations and thought leaders making such claims had still not even acknowledged the war crimes of October 7th as anything other than inevitable or even justifiable resistance against oppression. All of this was, to be sure, negationist anti-Semitism. Negationist anti-Zionism. In the most visible forms of pro-Palestinian activism, a more nuanced position of critique that recognized Jewish and Zionist humanity and aspirations was scarcely visible to be found. On my campus and many others, this process was particularly vivid as a series of rallies. Placards and chants laid out slogans like Intifada, Intifada, long live the Intifada, or from the rivers to the sea, Palestine will all be free, or when a people is occupied, resistance is justified. Now, before October 7th, people could argue that maybe these slogans were intended simply to call for the liberation of Palestinians, but not necessarily the murder of Jews, even if they resonated already in painful ways for many Jews due to acts of terror, the history of the Second Intifada, the fact that from the rivers to the sea was originally, among other things, a Hamas slogan that said from the rivers to the sea, Palestine will all be Arab. Right? There were already reasons for these slogans to resonate in a certain way, but now, since everyone was aware that Palestinian so-called resistance had just taken the form of brutal massacre of Jews, and no one chanting these slogans seemed at all concerned by these murders, but rather had used them as an instigation to rally, and no one chanting the slogans sought to clarify the meaning of their slogans as peaceful, it appeared much harder to differentiate the brutal impact of these slogans from any separate or more benign intentionality. Here we get to the third point about the unprecedented potency of negationist anti-Zionism post-October 7th. Jewish students, as they told myself and many others, literally heard the above chants as, quote, death to the Jews. Why did they hear them that way? It has something to do with a distinction that Darrell Horn makes between what she calls Hanukkah anti-Semitism and Purim anti-Semitism. Purim anti-Semitism is, you're like Haman, you want to kill all the Jews. Come up with a program, they didn't conform, they should be murdered. Hanukkah anti-Semitism is you're like the Greeks. You say, the Jews have to follow what we say, or else they really shouldn't be here. They've got to put away these parts of Jewish culture that we don't like. Now, before October 7th, negationist anti-Zionism, although not always anti-Semitic, very often took forms of Hanukkah anti-Semitism. Let me give you an example. On my campus, I had a student who was in a meeting where a Jewish student, a bunch of other students said, I hate the Jews on this campus. She said, okay, you guys know I'm Jewish. Oh, no. Not you. I hate the Zionists on this campus. Now, many people want to say, oh, but that doesn't sound anti-Semitic. They just hate the Zionists. They don't agree with him. But if we go to this idea of Hanukkah anti-Semitism, it's actually quite helpful, because what it means is, if you're a Zionist, if that part of your identity is visible and present, and you're not willing to put that away or disavow Zionism, then yes, I hate you as a Jew, right? So, slogans like From the River to the Sea or Intifada, Intifada might have been heard previously largely as Hanukkah anti-Semitism. That is, that students could feel pressured, silenced, their perspective was not able to be articulated because these chants were around them and no one was standing up to stop them. Now, though, they sounded like endorsements for the mass murder of Jews. They sounded far more threatening. So since October 7th, on many college campuses, also in other arenas, critical anti-Zionism has become muted in favor of an overwhelming cacophony of negationist anti-Zionism. It's become more difficult to differentiate the intentions of such anti-Zionism from its impact, and what was once an anti-Zionism that could manifest as it were, Hanukkah anti-Semitism, simply causing terrible social exclusion and conformity, not to be minimized, now resonates for many as Purim anti-Semitism that feels dangerous for the basic safety of Jews. To conclude, I've tried to argue here that historically anti-Zionism has been difficult to define and has had complex and ever-shifting relationships to anti-Semitism, but that we can detect two broad strands of anti-Zionism from the late 19th century to the present, which I've called critical and negationist respectively. While I've just painted a rather dark portrait of the turn that has taken since October 7th, I want to point out that this is again a contingent historical moment. One of the contexts we're living with right now is also widespread trauma. For many Jews, many Israelis, that means we are almost inevitably prone to see or hear anti-Semitism everywhere that we see a Palestinian flag or a placard or hear a strong anti-Zionist slogan. And so that does mean that there's another danger in this moment that we should also be aware of, treating all cases of critical anti-Zionism as negationist anti-Zionism or as anti-Semitic. And it's not just a theoretical danger, it too is happening on campuses where Palestinian students are being silenced, or where even wearing a keffiyeh, for instance, is provoking hostility before an expression is given to a political position. So we are in a way on the edge of a cliff, if you will, and we therefore need to pull back. I'm going to end here with a slide that just lays out some questions that I think are helpful to ask to try to determine when anti-Zionism is or is not anti-Semitic. Right? Is the given anti-Zionist expression using symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism, like when people talk about the so-called Jewish lobby or the power of the Jews, or they call Israel a bloodthirsty country? Is the anti-Zionism comparing Israel's policies to those of the Nazis? Is the act of anti-Zionism denying the Jewish people the right to a state while defending the collective rights of other ethnic or national groups? Is the expression of anti-Zionism blaming all Jews for the actions of the Israeli government, or disqualifying a person because of an association with Israel, or asking a Jewish student to take a particular position on Israel simply because they are Jewish? Is the speaker focused on a particular issue and criticizing specific policies of the state of Israel? So, some people may have hoped that there was going to be a clear yes or no answer to the question posed in the title here. I think the reality is that the answer is to the question, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitic? The answer is very often yes, but not necessarily, and it depends a great deal on context. Thank you.
So I'm wondering if there's a portable microphone supposedly that we ask the tech people. That way, since this is being live streamed and also recorded, your questions, so we give Professor Katz a minute to catch his breath. And,
Your questions can be immortalized. As I always say, I will take any question. Just be nice and respectful. Those are my only provisos.
Just 1 second. You have it? Okay. All right, thanks. Yeah, so there's one on each side. So do you want to just call on people? Yeah.
Sure. Sorry, I saw that hand first. Sorry.
Hello. Do you guys hear me? First of all, thanks for coming today. A bit about me. My name is Abud al-Ashab. I'm a student from Palestine, and my friend Hisham was shot in Vermont in a hate crime this past weekend for wearing a keffiyeh and speaking Arabic. Can you state what you mean by the symbolism of the keffiyeh in your work and in your discourse right now?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I heard about this tragedy, and I'm very sorry, and I think we all pray for the health and full recovery of your friend. So, the keffiyeh came to be associated for many people with the Palestine Liberation Organization during a time when that organization was unapologetic about its embrace of terrorism, that is, violence against usually Jewish civilians, in order to try to achieve progress for Palestinian nationalism. It became associated with groups that were called the Fedayeen, or the freedom fighters, and that were violent with their tactics. So therefore, it became associated for many people with violent resistance that on a number of occasions led to the murder of Jewish civilians. It's complicated. I mean, Lawrence of Arabia wore a keffiyeh during World War I. Obviously not a terrorist. Yasser Arafat, during all of his negotiations as the leader, the legitimate leader of the PLO, wore the keffiyeh. It was one of his symbols. So it's undoubtedly reductionist, right?
It very much is, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but Lawrence of Arabia, that wasn't a keffiyeh. That's a different top that they wear in the Arabian Peninsula.
Forgive me.
But
Yep.
why are you creating association as a statement and as kind of almost like fact and part of your argument? The PLO, which was made in 1964, that's an organization that's associated with a goal, which is not, in their charter, you don't find anything about harming Jewish civilians, and we can debate about that later. But why are you drawing keffiyehs and keffiyehs on campus? Something my friend was shot for, something I wear.
So
why do you associate?
I'm going to cut you off because I'm just going to try to clarify, because I always want to operate with assuming good faith. So I'm going to assume that you misheard me, because what I said was that unfortunately we have people right now who are associating a Palestinian flag with anti-Jewish hatred, and that is dangerous. I said, unfortunately, we have people right now associating keffiyehs with anti-Jewish hatred, and that is dangerous. So I was denouncing drawing that connection in some automatic way. I cannot control the fact that there are thousands of Jewish people who make that assumption. So me stating here that is a fact, I don't believe is promoting that discourse. I'm actually saying that even in a moment where I do have tremendous concerns about the way that anti-Zionism is bleeding into anti-Semitism in new ways that I described, even in that moment, we need to pull back from the cliff of thinking that anyone who is strongly pro-Palestinian and shows it in some way or other, like waving a Palestinian flag or wearing a keffiyeh, we need to pull back from the cliff of thinking that person is an anti-Semite. So that's what I tried to say.
Okay, but that was kind of different than what you stated in your kind of
I can read you the words from my lecture.
Yes. I also... Okay, thank you.
Right.
Thank you. This doesn't get at the central question of your talk, but because it's something that has come up so much in campus discourse around these issues, I was wondering if you could speak to the idea of self-determination versus supremacy. So the idea of Zionism as racism, or you saying that it's a negationist to deny self-determination in this case. Can you say a little more about that?
Sure. It's a really good question. So I think it's a tricky matter because it partly depends on what we mean by self-determination, right? Where I think that we get into a clearly negationist discourse is when we deny the rights of Jews to have some kind of collective security and sovereignty in some fashion, in some portion of historic Palestine, right? So that could take the form of a federated state. And we have Zionists today who are advocating for a federated state. They're a minority, but there are a variety of movements out there, for instance, and there's a long history of that, right? So if you say, I don't think there's any need to give any real credence to the idea that Jews must have collective rights in some portion of the land, that is completely negating sort of basic underpinnings of Zionism. And then my question is, are you against collective rights for all peoples that have committed injustices? Because pretty much all national liberation movements in the history of the planet have committed violence and injustice. That doesn't mean to deny the importance of violence and injustice on the part of the Zionist movement. It's just a fact. So the question would be, why are you in particular against, why would you like to renounce Jewish collective rights? And there I think we're in a situation where it's certainly plausible to say this is a double standard that doesn't have any logic, and you're denying Jews' rights that you are defending for others. That seems anti-Semitic. Jewish supremacy, I don't want to act like I'm ignoring that question because it's a hard and it's an important question. Right, I mean, that comes down to policies of the State of Israel. I'm personally not fond of the terminology of Jewish supremacy. I understand where it comes from. I think it's problematic terminology, just given histories of white supremacy, histories of ideas about Jews where notions of Jewish supremacy could be used for anti-Semitic purposes. But I think that comes down to a question. I mean, it's a legitimate critique to say that Jews have far more rights even than Palestinian Arab citizens in Israel, particularly around things like land rights. And that's a legitimate area of critique. Whether calling it Jewish supremacy is the most productive or effective is a different question. But so that, to me, is different than self-determination in the sense that that's how you end up setting up your polity. And there's not any reason that Jewish self-determination, in my view, has to mean Jewish supremacy. I saw a hand over here before. No? Okay. Sure.
Hi, thank you. I have kind of two questions, and obviously before I ask the questions, I've been finding the constant need to reaffirm my position and having stake in this, as a Jew with family in Israel whose community members are continuing to be held hostage in Gaza and whose family this has affected every part of our lives. So reaffirming that I too have stake in this, I want to ask the following questions. The first question is, if we were to categorize every violent, I don't even want to call October 7th resistance because I feel uncomfortable with that also. Mm-hmm. And yet, if we are going to call it anti-Semitic, we are going to therefore have to call violence and inhumane, let's say, inhumane violence in Algeria, inhumane violence in India, inhumane violence done, let's say, by slaves upon their slave owners. Mm-hmm. We too are going to have to categorize that as some kind of identity-based violence. I'm not going to sit here and say that I'm equating the state of Israel to any of those examples, because mm-hmm. I don't believe in doing that. Mm-hmm. I think that the difference between all of those examples is that Israelis and Jews really do have nowhere else to go. Mm-hmm. And so this isn't, in my opinion, I have a hard time with the colonial framework before 67 lines. I have an easier time calling it a colonial framework after 67 lines. Before 67 lines, how are we to expect a people who lives under constant oppression, mm-hmm. systemic oppression for the past mm-hmm. 75 years, to open a history book, mm-hmm. look at the history of projects that have worked towards decolonization against a country that I won't call a colonial country, mm-hmm. because I feel problematic about that, mm-hmm. but uses very similar tactics mm-hmm. and shows itself to be one in the tactics it uses mm-hmm. that are very reminiscent of British, mm-hmm. French, insert Western European country here, tactics. If you were to open a history book and look at how decolonial movements work, is that not the conclusion you come to? I have a hard time with it because I don't believe that just because anti-colonialism has historically been done violently, we can come to terms with the fact that it will always be done violently. I refuse to surrender to that notion. But to call October 7th anti-Semitic feels like a little bit of sidestepping real historical frameworks for how inhumane and disgusting and disturbing geopolitics are. I think I'm not going to sit here and say it's inhumane. I'm going to sit here and say I feel weird calling it anti-Semitic.
Okay, I understand. Thank you for the question and the comparative framework, which is an important and a hard question. First of all, I'm just going to say, you don't have to say it, but I've said it publicly before, and I'll say it right here again. Israel, to my mind, is simultaneously the product of a legitimate national liberation struggle on the part of a historically oppressed minority, and since 1967 in particular, some will argue since earlier, it has become, in certain crucial respects, a profoundly colonialist entity. I'm sure half the people in the room didn't like at least part of that statement. But the reality is you've got to be able to hold those things up at once. I mean, so without any pun intended, you might free yourself from some of the anxiety you're feeling by just being able to recognize that it's not me, it's Ari Shavit, who writes in his book, My Promised Land, about Israel and colonialism. If it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck, right? And that he doesn't want to accept Israel as its colonial elements, but it's very hard to escape the fact that it has some. It is a completely insufficient frame to explain all of Israel or all the conflict or all the history. And people who are trying to use settler colonialism as their sole frame, I think it's incredibly problematic conceptually and historically. But it is one piece of the story that's an important piece of the story. In terms of anti-colonial violence, yes, it's true that it is not unique to this setting. And now I'm going to say some things that I don't want, lest I offend anyone here. A very distinguished colleague of mine pointed out recently that the fact of the matter is it's not universal either. Many people have compared October 7th to Nat Turner's rebellion. 100-some people died in Nat Turner's rebellion, and it was very rare as a slave revolt in the United States, as a violent response to the oppression of slavery that went on for centuries. This is not any claim for the superiority of Jewish ethics, but it is an empirical fact that after 6 million Jews were murdered in 1945, very few Jews took violent reprisals. In South Africa, in the late years of apartheid, very few nationalists committed violent acts against white South Africans. That's just factual, and there is a much longer history of murder of Jewish civilians by a select, not by most, not by the majority, not embodying some innate character of Palestinians. Please do not distort or misunderstand my words. But there is a longer history of 1929, 1936 to 1939, certain atrocities in 1948, a lot of terrorist acts in the 1970s and 1980s against Jewish civilians. That just means that there's something in the national project, in strands of it, that have thought that violence was okay and even good. And I do think if we want to think about both context for October 7th and ways that we hopefully find a peaceful future, that kind of outlook is one that has to be addressed, just like there are many Israeli policies and longstanding crimes of Zionism that also have to be addressed. So whether we call it anti-Semitic or not, what happened on October 7th, I don't think it's the most important thing. I think it's really hard to have a conversation with Jews right now without understanding why it resonates as anti-Semitic. And two things can be true at once, right? I mean, you could claim that it's both an anti-Semitic act and an act that at least for many Palestinians seems to represent an act of resistance. I'm super uncomfortable with it being called an act of resistance, but I can understand that some of my Palestinian colleagues are maybe very uncomfortable with it being called an anti-Semitic act, and part of any kind of dialogue is being able to at least hear each other's truths.
Hi. Quick question. So what do you think of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism?
I never get tired of talking about that. So I think the IHRA, look, all of the definitions are useful tools. None of them should be speech codes. I mean, that's sort of the bottom line. The IHRA definition in itself has some valuable points. I think the words of the definition before the examples are not a particularly good definition of anti-Semitism. They're actually, it's sort of a a choppy wording. Some of the examples are really useful. The framing that says these all must be considered in context is crucial. The framing that says critiques of Israel that are like critiques of any other state should not be considered as anti-Semitic, that's crucial. The problem is that's not the way it's often used, right? And we have a whole host of individuals and groups who have tried to get the IHRA to be adopted in an official way as effectively a kind of speech code. And there's just numerous examples of that. That's where I think we get into trouble. And I mean, all these definitions, if they're applied mechanistically, if you apply the Jerusalem Declaration, the most well-known competing definition mechanistically, I believe you would end up saying a bunch of things are not anti-Semitic that kind of clearly are, right? So definitions, they give us guidelines. They're useful in that way. I think we get into real trouble when we try to say, I'm going to put this through the grinder of IRA and it's going to tell me if it is or is not anti-Semitic.
If I may ask another very quick question.
Okay.
Campuses across the United States have turned into very hateful places, and I do believe you're correct about negationist anti-Zionism becoming very, very popular. What do you think campuses and administrations should do to counter this?
All right, well, that's another talk. No, really, I mean, it's a very important subject. That's why I started the initiative that I did 4.5 years ago. I basically think Jewish students' concerns need to be considered in the broader framework of diversity, equity, and inclusion, like those of other historically marginalized groups. Jewish students need to be heard out when they have experiences that they believe are anti-Semitic. There need to be clear mechanisms for reporting those incidents. There needs to be a level of expertise and training for people, just like there are in other areas of exclusion and hate. Those are beginnings. Okay. Yep.
I just seeking some clarification on what you're referring to as, the Jewish people's right to a state.
Mm-hmm.
Are you referring to a state in which, and I'll have a follow-up question depending. Are you referring to the right to a state in which Jewish people hold a majority, or are you referring to a state in which Jewish people have like unalienable rights prescribed in and protected by other nations? Do you specifically want a majority or more of like an all-around democracy?
It's a very good question. So first of all, it's actually a recommendation for everybody in the room who has the time and the interest. I highly recommend Dmitry Shumsky's recent book, which I referred to very briefly, called Beyond the Nation State, because what he shows there is that many of the early Zionists, even to some degree up through Jabotinsky and Ben-Gurion, certainly including Herzl, Pinsker, Ahad Ha'am, they did not imagine necessarily creating what we consider a modern nation state, right? They imagined creating some kind of a space in historic Palestine where Jews could thrive and they could practice their culture and they could have a certain degree of autonomy. That's collective rights and collective security at its most basic level. And to me, that's what any sort of self-ascribed people with a long history of understanding themselves as a people and with, sort of basic needs and vulnerabilities that can only be met collectively, that's what they're entitled to, right? So there's lots of merits to the current state of Israel. I think there's a lot of arguments for two-state solution, which would maintain majority Jewish and Palestinian states, but many people think that ship has sailed and the two-state solution is no longer realistic. And we may need to think more creatively. And I think in thinking more creatively, as long as we're maintaining individual and collective equality for both Jews and Palestinian Arabs, there's a lot of different possibilities. You have a follow-up.
Yes, thank you. Okay, thank you for that clarification. Really appreciate it. In the case of like negationist Zionism, I feel like a lot of what you're referring to as negationist or referring to as inherently anti-Semitic may in fact be calling for that, like, for a like pure democracy, not a pure, for a like more legitimate democracy in which there is a one state in which Jews do not necessarily hold a majority. Would you view that type of like negation of a Jewish majority state as anti-Semitic then?
Right. so you're asking a good question, and I think it actually gets us to an important point of precision. To my mind, there's an important difference between what some people call a state of all its citizens and a binational state. A state of all its citizens is more of what you just referred to, a pure democracy. Therefore, if the Jews are 40% of the population in 20 years and they cannot get their rights respected, who knows what will happen? That's that's sort of a safety concern. But even at the level of culture, there's not any particular reason why such a state must guarantee that it has both Jewish and Arab character, right? Whereas a binational state is from the outset constructed in a way that has ideas about a certain number of members of parliament from different ethnic religious groups, has ideas about certain kinds of symbols and traditions and cultures that are built into the national fabric and national traditions, and that holds space and maybe has federated cantons geographically. That holds space and guarantees for collective rights for both peoples in a way that a, quote, state of all its citizens doesn't. I'm tired of talking about definitions of anti-Semitism. Spent hours of my life on that I can never have back. But so in some ways, I'm not that interested in whether a state of all its citizens is, quote, anti-Semitic or not. It does mean effectively the liquidation of a collective Jewish entity that has sovereign Jewish character in a portion of historic Palestine over time, almost inevitably. And I think that's super problematic, and I don't find there to be any really rational or ethical basis for that over the liquidation of numerous other collective sovereign entities on the planet. And I think Jews have the right to ask why they would be singled out in that way.
Thank you so much for coming. So often Zionism is talked about with a very, I'm going to use this word, Ashkenormative view, a very Eurocentric view. I'm a very proud Mizrahi Jew. My parents escaped Iran in 1979 after the Iranian Revolution because it fully became unsafe for Jews to live there. And this is an experience shared by many other Jews living now, is called Mizrahim. Yes. Jews who were persecuted and who escaped Iraq as the Farhud, from Yemen, from Algeria, from Egypt. It's an experience that so many Mizrahim have. I know this might not be your level of expertise, but
I wrote a book on Jews and Muslims in France and French North Africa. Beautiful. So yes, I do know something about this topic.
If you could speak a little bit to the ideas of Zionism and the returning, or I guess the longing for Zion,
right,
from a Mizrahi perspective, because in my view, in my genealogy's view,
sure,
we never left Babylon after Babylonian captivity. We stayed there,
right,
and that's how Persian Jews and a lot of
yep,
Middle Eastern Jews came to be. And so there's always been that yearning
yep,
to go back. Could you explain and just highlight a bit more on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, it's a major topic of research and debate today, sort of the relationship between Zionism and Mizrahi Jews. The reality is that, as you've already alluded to, right, there's a longer history of what we would call a cultural or religious, or sometimes either or, Zionism among Mizrahi Jews that goes back, decades or centuries in some ways before the founding of the modern Zionist movement. And, Zionism resonated in particular ways with that long, political Zionism resonated in particular ways with that longer history. And I mean, we hear stories about, Jews in Yemen who heard there's a Jewish state being created in Palestine, and they got on their donkeys and they, went hundreds of miles because they were like, oh my gosh, this is like the dream of 2,000 years. And it's quite powerful. When Mizrahi Jews came to Israel, as you're undoubtedly aware, there was an attempt to kind of, put them into a box of labor Zionist ideology to in many ways evacuate the Arabness that had been core to many identities, or the Persianness in the case of Jews from Iran. I'm not calling Jews from Iran Arab Jews. I've seen people do that in print before, but I know better. I mean, and that's, that created all kinds of cultural resentments. It is partly what accounts for the way that Mizrahi Jews gravitated over time to the Likud party, where they felt that they were more spoken for and more heard. And it's also accounted for a whole kind of cultural debate among certain intellectual figures in Israel over the past 35 years I'm not sure whether it means something different for anti-Zionism per se, except that I think for many of Mizrahi Jews today still, or their parents or grandparents, had this very direct experience of Zionism being essential to their capacity to find a place to live safely during the tumult of the mid to late 20th century in the Islamic world. And so in that way, Zionism has this tangible element of not only longstanding culture, but also safety for Mizrahi Jews that, depending on your generation and your positionality, it might less so have for certain Ashkenazi Jews.
Can I ask a quick follow-up, or if there's no time, we can shut it down?
Sure.
Actually, I'll.
Sure?
No, it's okay. It's okay.
Okay. Thanks for the question. I see a hand right there.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could elaborate on like how you interpret the phrase "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free."
Right. I was quoted in an article in the Washington Post about that, which was a pretty good article, so I encourage people to look at that, actually. Not because my quotes were not particularly brilliant, but it was a good article. So, I mean, it clearly has many meanings in a certain sense, right? I mean, it's hard to even pin down the origins. It appears to come from phrases that were first used by Palestinian nationalists in the 1960s. And then it was also, very similar phrases were used by right-wing Zionists to talk about the land of Israel, from the rivers to the sea, and notions of greater Israel. There clearly are many people who are chanting that slogan today who are either simply like people who go to rallies and chant slogans that they have no idea what they mean because everybody around them is chanting the slogan, which is something I advise against. But, or people who think like, this is about liberation, this is about equality. They don't really, it's about freeing Palestinians. They don't have a political program in mind necessarily. But the reality is that certainly it has been a slogan used by Hamas. And the slogan when Hamas uses it is Palestine will all be Arab. Okay? That seems less equivocal than Palestine will all be free. And the fact that Hamas has used the slogan for a long time, to me, it's a legitimate reason why Jews hear it a certain way. We don't have to think that normatively speaking, something is offensive to want to be sensitive to each other. And I'm going to give an example, and forgive me if I offend anybody with this example. Blue Lives Matter was a slogan that was adopted by a lot of people who wanted to be supportive of cops in the face of Black Lives Matter and the death of certain cops in confrontations with African Americans. I don't think the people who adopted that slogan meant it to negate Black Lives Matter. I think they meant it because they were concerned about cops and they wanted cops' lives to also be brought into the conversation. What they discovered quickly was that many, many African Americans heard that as a negation of Black Lives Matter and in a way that even sounded racist to them. Very few people are using the phrase Blue Lives Matter anymore. And if they are, they know it's associated with very conservative political positions. So to me, as a matter of both strategy and humanity, if we know that there are concrete reasons that a slogan we are using is offending people because of their particular positionality or history, we should think, could we make the same political point with a different slogan? I see a hand right here.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I'm, as a Jewish student who's proudly Zionist, but also has definitely critiques of Israel state, Israel government, whatever. I would love to have conversations with my classmates, with people at my university, which is going to be honest, transparent, open, because I think that is, in many cases, why I came to a university in the first place, to hear other people's perspective. And it is true that I have not in my life interacted with many people who have negatively been affected by Israel, and I would love to learn more. However, it's been impossible to do so starting October 7th because I get met with slogans, with ideas that sound anti-Semitic to me, right? Even hearing that Jews are all powerful and of course you are oppressing a minority, that is already a starting point at which I'm like, I'm sorry, like this is not going to be a productive conversation. And a lot of your work is around building those healthy conversations. And even though I do, believe in that government as well, but university can facilitate those discussions, I would love to have one-on-one conversations with my friends and classmates. But how can we do that when those guidelines in the first place that I would love not to hear from the river to the sea on my college campus, and I do think it's hate speech, how can we approach those conversations in a productive way without being shut down into like little echo chambers that I think are being created right now?
It's a super hard question. If I really knew the answer, I'd probably do something else for a living. No, it's a really good question. I think, you know, I'm going to say a few things. One thing I'm going to say is that I'm just going to say this because I think it's been on the mind of many Jews since October 7th, and I think it's just useful to say it out loud. I think for many, many Jews like yourself, if people start by saying what Hamas did on October 7th was a horrific act of massacre, and I condemn it, you, me, many of us could be willing to engage with someone about almost any level of critique they have of Israel if that point has been acknowledged at the outset. And for many people, some people don't want to talk about context at all vis-a-vis October 7th. I disagree with that position. We can talk about that. But for many people, they recognize that, of course, these events didn't happen in a vacuum. Of course, there's a lot to critique about Israel's policy vis-a-vis Gaza, Israel's policy in the West Bank, Israel's policies on Palestinians. But if you can't start from that basic human acknowledgement, then as a Jew, as a person attached to Israel, you feel like your humanity is just being denied, right? So I think it's just important for people to recognize that. And it's not because it's a requirement that Jews or powerful people are setting for a conversation. It's really about just seeing your fellow humans' humanity. Having said all that, you're not going to get that from everybody, right? And I think in some ways, look, the starting point that I recommend to people sometimes is go listen to a presentation that advocates for the other point of view that's really hard to hear, or go read a book that advocates for the other point of view that's really hard to read, and then reach out to your classmate or colleague and say, I heard this presentation, I read this book, there were a lot of things in there that were hard for me to hear, but I think I get more where you're coming from now. Would you be willing to sit and talk? The worst the person can say is no, and they might. But the reality is, you know, I basically think we should, if we want to have conversations, especially at a time where it's so hard, we have to set as few conditions on those conversations as possible. Despite what I said a minute ago about what Jews want, the reality is, if I want to sit with someone and I want them to be willing to hear me out, and I had a conversation like this in my office with an Algerian student who was like so annoyed that people have to say that at the beginning of a conversation. And we had a healthy, productive exchange because I didn't say to her, well, you got to get out of my office. You know, I can't talk to you. Like I know, but I can't handle it, which I could have said, you know. And so I said, well, okay, why are you so resistant to saying that at the beginning? Why are you offended by this thing over here, which I can't imagine why it's offensive to you? And, you know, we heard each other out, but I think, you know, we have to try to find a way to let people know that they can say the things that make us uncomfortable, and somehow our identity is strong enough that we're not threatened by those things, that we can listen, and that all we really ask is that in return, they also be willing to listen. I know it's a lot easier for me to say that than it is to do it. Way back there. You. You've written out the questions. I mean, that's always impressive. Go on.
Who do you think gets to determine the definition of political ideology? When we look at communism, are we supposed to think about it purely in Marxist terms or in terms of its manifestation in the real world? Similarly, we can always get bogged down about the different definitions and strands of Zionism, but how can we be expected to not see Zionism through the lens of how it's being manifested today? And is it so crazy to ask people to distance themselves from Zionism when Zionism today means right to Jews to a democratic state, and that means a Jewish majority, which means ethnic engineering and ethnic cleansing? That has promoted and enabled people like Bibi and Ben-Gvir to exist. Is anti-Zionism not to be expected when that is the case?
There's a lot there, and I don't accept all the assumptions and leaps in what you said. Just to be transparent about that. The basic question you're asking is about who gets to define ideology is an important question. And what I would say about most ideologies is they cannot be solely defined by the exponents or architects of those ideologies. They're participants in the movement, but those participants and architects have an important role in defining what their movement's about. It's true for communism, it's true for Palestinian nationalism, it's true for basically all movements. The others who are impacted by those movements, especially in very tangible ways, also, of course, should have an opportunity to define them. Zionism means a lot of things. I'm not talking about multiple Zionist movements. I'm saying, like, on the ground in Israel, if we can compartmentalize for a hot second the conflict, like, we should realize that in terms of normalizing Jewish citizenship, giving Jews the opportunity for cultural renewal, reclaiming the Hebrew language, reclaiming all kinds of opportunities for religious expression and religious study. Those are all real parts of what Zionism means on the ground. Zionism on the ground does mean really destructive things for many Palestinians, and I'm not denying that, but it means a lot of things on the ground, right? So, I mean, I don't think anyone should feel bullied into taking a political position under most circumstances, and unless you want to go around telling people that any nation state with which they identify that is committing injustices they should be uncomfortable continuing to identify with, then I don't think you should do that to Jewish students vis-a-vis Zionism, right? I mean, we are very uncomfortable with attacks on Chinese people because people are angry about genocide against the Uyghurs, or they're angry about choices the Chinese government made vis-a-vis the early outbreak of COVID. We saw that happen in this country. We're very resistant to people attacking Muslims or Afghanis because of the Taliban or Al-Qaeda, right? We consider those things to be racist and wrong, and we don't think that someone has to be identified with every single, thing that was done that we find objectionable. And I think we should apply that same standard. We should be consistent. And so we can have critiques, strong critiques of Zionist policy, but unless we're going to go around telling all Chinese people that because we think their government's undemocratic, they should no longer identify with China if they want to be our friend or if they want to be a credible progressive, I don't think we should be telling that to people vis-a-vis Zionism in Israel.
Okay. I think at this point, we're going to have to bring this to a conclusion. I want to thank Professor Katz for a fascinating talk. We hope to have many other opportunities on this campus for reasoned discussion, which is very refreshing, and really appreciate it very much. So thank you.
Thank you all for coming. You've been a great audience.